domestic violence, because that's a life and death issue in many ways. And we have with us tonight Bettina Arndt. Thank you for joining us. And of course a social commentator of some note. We wanted to talk about domestic violence because it's not just an area of significant funding by government. It is about human behaviour and is about quality of life. In your view, in your experience, what is the source? Forget whether we're talking about men or women, we'll come back to that. What is the source of domestic violence? Why does it happen?
Because it's not my view, it's 40 years of research showing the causal factors in domestic violence are things like mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, poverty. I mean, it's 60 times more common in some communities in Western New South Wales, for instance, than it is in, the fancier suburbs of Sydney. And growing up in a violent home, that's one of the causal factors. And they're the issues we should be addressing. And yet we have this huge industry in Australia promoting the view it's all about nasty men and the way they treat women.
So in other words, if a child, whether a boy or a girl, grows up in a violent home, they are likely to develop, obviously, violence of some kind, regardless of whether they're boy or girl.
And children in Australia, okay, some of them, a tiny proportion of children in violent homes are seeing what we hear all about, this man terrorising his wife, their mother, patriarchal terrorism, they call it. That's a tiny proportion of violent homes. Most children are actually witnessing their mothers and fathers having a go at each other. And we're lying to those kids. We're saying, we don't want to hear that. We only want to hear if you're talking about dad. We don't want to hear if you're talking about your mother having a go at you or having a go at dad. It's gobsmacking to me. You think of how we used to talk about child sexual abuse and we didn't listen to those kids telling their stories. And now we're not hearing what children have to say about what their experiences of violence are.
I must say I was really interested in reading the material that you had just recently in The Australian, and you had a lot of numbers there from the ABS, and you've spoken to quite a few of the Bureau of Criminology, etc., and looking at some of these numbers. Could you just give us a bit of a sense of what those numbers are? Because a lot of that discussion in your paper recently was, why is it that we have all this focus on the women, but there doesn't seem to be any commentary on the violence, which is
the two-way violence
on the men.
And also, we're constantly told there's an epidemic of violence. Yeah. We actually live in a very safe society. Most women aren't exposed to violence. The figures on physical violence from the ABS show that 1.06% of women each year are abused by their partner. Tiny proportion. And yet you hear these figures, 1 in 3. That 1 in 3 figure we've always been told refers to violence over a woman's lifetime, and not just violence by a partner. It could be having a go at someone as a result of road rage or running into a shopping cart, and it could have occurred 50 years ago, because that also includes women who are now 70. I mean, there's this constant blowout of statistics to make it appear something that it's not. I had Don Weatherburn, head of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Stats, saying there is no epidemic of domestic violence. Every evidence suggests domestic violence is going down. But that's not what this enormous domestic violence bureaucracy wants to promote, because they're after more money. They're always looking for money to promote this view that it's all about violent men. And they won't hear anything else. They're not interested in what the research actually says.
So why is it that these groups, do you see it just as a straight out financial benefit, or, I mean, how do you want to describe that?
Look, it's really
situation?
interesting.
Because it's an odd one, isn't it? I mean, every now and there in politics, you get a position, I think of fracking, completely different issue, but you just can't get anybody to look at the science and have a sort of rational view. Is this some sort of irrational situation?
All you politicians throwing money at this problem, so that thinking you're going to win the women's vote. Women aren't mugs. I mean, if you go out in the community and talk to people about that, women know other women are violent. They know ice addicts don't turn into little angels when they get home, or bullying little girls don't end up being gorgeous, sweet, docile mothers, or, they know that, people who are mentally disturbed can be women as well as men who lash out at other people in the family. I mean, what's intriguing for me is how this whole country has been captured by this ideological position. And there's a very interesting woman who talks about this, who was the woman who set up the first refuge in Britain. Her name is Erin Pizzey, yeah. And she started talking back in the 70s about the fact that in her refuge, she found there were violent women as well as, you know, women who were escaping from violent men. And she started to talk about that, women who were attacking the other women in the refuge and being aggressive towards their kids. She had to leave Britain. She had death threats. Her dog was killed. And I mean,
Why, because she bucked the system?
Because she bucked the system. She started to say violence is not a gender issue, and no one wanted to hear that. And her argument is the women's movement was beginning to lose some momentum at that time, and they, you know, they'd had their first big splash, and money was pouring in, and they blotted their copybook by doing some pretty stupid things. This issue is absolute gold when it comes to politicking, because no one will challenge it.
But what about White Ribbon as an organisation? What's your view of them?
Well, White Ribbon is part of the problem. White Ribbon is an organisation designed to enlist men who think they're doing the right thing by standing up against domestic violence. And of course, domestic violence...
Well, I've been one of those.
Yeah, of course, it's a very important problem. But the White Ribbon tells lies about domestic violence. White Ribbon never mentions violent women. They don't acknowledge the research showing that the research is very clear about this two-way violence. And if you ask men and women who perpetrates violence, women will say, I'm in there having a go at him as well. That's what the surveys all over the world, including Australia, show. And White Ribbon totally denies that. No, 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 it's all about men. And we have to teach men to behave. We have to teach men to show respect for women. That is not how we should be addressing this issue.
So what do they do with the money? What does White Ribbon do with the money?
I mean, Malcolm Turnbull boasts that they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on domestic violence. White Ribbon holds all these charity events where men strut around proving how good they are. And they run programs in schools teaching little boys how aggressive they are. And I've had mothers write to me saying my daughter was really upset because she was in this classroom of her mates, boys and girls, and the boys had to stand up and confess that, you know, that they were bad boys and they shouldn't be violent. And girls just sat there. We know that's not the case. When we were in the playground, you know, we're throwing things at the boy, whatever. I mean, people know that the story is more complex than that. Yeah. White Ribbon is infiltrating our society. It's the most extraordinary thing. In bureaucracies, in public service offices around the country, White Ribbon are there running education programs.
Well,
it's like Stasi land, this stuff.
One thing that really struck me was the story or the evidence in respect of the hospital and medical system that we run in this country, where there's a lot of funding for breast reconstruction, which is obviously necessary, but for the blokes who've had prostate cancer, they don't get a cent.
Well, that's one of my pet topics.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been out there campaigning for years about why aren't men marching the street for the right to an erect penis? I mean, how is it that we pour money into breast cancer, as we should, but we spend nothing on helping men recover from prostate cancer treatments?
Because men don't like talking about it.
Men won't talk about it. And men won't talk about being victims of domestic violence. I mean, if you were being beaten up by your wife, would you tell anybody?
No, I mean, my wife wouldn't, but no, you wouldn't, because you'd be ashamed.
You'd be ashamed. You know what's amazing? We have a national framework, domestic violence framework, which says that if a man rings a helpline saying he's a victim of domestic violence, they're to call the police, they're to track down his identity through whatever you do these days, and contact the partner to verify his story. I mean, what sort of betrayal is that of, you know, his confidentiality, of our duty of care to that man? That's our official domestic violence policy. And it's running amok, this crazy ideological stuff.
Although, I think you also do say, though, that the raising of awareness about domestic violence has been an important development in recent times, even though you may not be happy with White Ribbon or Rosie Batty or whoever.
Oh no, look, this is a really important issue, and it's been just critical to give women the courage to speak out when they're being abused and to have places for them to go. I mean, I'd always support that. We always have to acknowledge that if a man and women are being violent, the woman is more likely to get hurt, the woman is more likely to be injured, the woman is more likely to be killed. But, you know, we have a significant proportion of the people being killed by their partners are men. They get 2 inches in the newspaper. The story never gets beaten up. And why is it that when a woman kills a man, that isn't a big story too?
Bettina, obviously, I share the view, which I'm sure we all do. No one likes violence in a relationship, whether it's men or women. I mean, obviously, violence is one of those things we try and discourage at any opportunity. So what is the answer in the long term? How do we stop domestic violence, regardless of whether it's men or women? What's the answer?
Look, there are programs in place all over the world looking at how to address this problem properly, which is about looking at the link with alcohol abuse and targeting people known to be violent when they drink a lot, and they've got particular programs where they keep an eye on those guys or women and follow them through, people, you know, on ice, that sort of thing. We obviously have to put the money more in communities like our Indigenous communities where there's a huge amount of two-way violence. We have to help couples who are struggling with this problem learn to deal with conflict without being violent towards each other.
Does ice make it so much harder because people lose control?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, drug and alcohol abuse are one of the major contributors to this problem. But we have to target people in that situation, not just get out there and say, all you men are potentially abusive and you have to change your ways. I mean, that's not the way to approach this really important social problem.
I found some evidence too here that in a 2001 young people in domestic violence study, which found that 14.4% of children were witnessing two-way parental couple violence. Now,
much higher than the percentage who are witnessing just dad having a go at mum.
Yeah, so does that suggest, though, that in that area we're underfunded? And are there parts of dealing with this that really are beyond the capability?
Look, obviously, this is hard stuff. I mean, this is docs, this is community services, you know, who are monitoring these families who are in trouble. Yeah. And, you know, let's put some of the money that's going into these propaganda units towards giving the people working in those communities more money.
Some of the $30 million of the current TV
hundreds of millions of dollars. Put some of that, more of that, towards working with troubled couples. I mean, there was a woman on Life Matters, the Radio National program the other day, who was violent, who grew up in a violent home. And she said she went around trying to get help for herself because she was finding she was lashing out at her partner. And all the perpetrators' programs laughed at her and said, go away, we don't deal with women. Women aren't violent. And that's just crazy.
Another aspect to this, which also I found, well, was perhaps disturbing in some ways, but the way in which the courts, the magistrates in particular, deal with some of these issues, and in particular, allegedly, well, from reading what you had to say, in some senses, a bias in respect of one party as opposed to the other, and a usage of apprehended violence orders. Now, there is some information we got as to how much that is used and the way in which is used really as a tactic. Now,
in divorces.
I have no doubt that there must be a number of cases where magistrates have to operate and have to deal with blokes who've really done the wrong thing, and they should have the book thrown at them. But for those who haven't actually done anything per se,
look, we've had surveys done of lawyers and of magistrates who all acknowledge this is now a major tactic in divorce. It is a really powerful tool for a woman to use if she wants to get rid of her husband. If she calls up and alleges, no evidence whatsoever, she can just allege he's been violent towards her, she'll be given an AVO. As a matter of course, she can have that man removed from her home, locked out of her home. It will really help her in gaining an advantage when it comes to the divorce settlement, the property settlement, and keeping the man away from her children. I mean, it is a total scandal the way AVOs are used in the whole divorce system now, and magistrates and lawyers are acknowledging that.
How do you deal with that though? Because the woman may well have been subject to some nasty attack.
Your government tried to do something about it. John Howard actually introduced legislation, part of the family law legislation. There were penalties for false allegations of sexual abuse and domestic violence. And of course, when Labor came in, they were removed.
Oh, I see, right.
And that, you know, that is part of the story. This is why it's absolutely proliferating.
So that's biased, the system.
Absolutely.
Our legal system is being used for that purpose.
Absolutely. And constant attempts to expand the definition of violence. There's legislation before Queensland and Western Australia to introduce all sorts of new definitions of violence, you know, criticising the way a woman does her housework, criticising what she's wearing, even remaining silent is now included in the definition of domestic violence that's being put to magistrates and judges. I mean, that's lunacy. This ever-expanding definition and the constant watering down of protection under law for people wrongly accused. We have to address that issue.
Tina, it seems to me, though, if part of it is changing community attitudes, you've raised the issue about, obviously, violence against men, and we've accepted that violence against women is clearly a problem. The $30 million TV campaign, advertising campaign, should that be changed to make sure if we are going to change attitudes, it's more balanced?
Oh, absolutely. I think that.
What would you like to see?
I had so many people contact me after that ad was run, men and women, saying that that ad is a disgrace. The little boy slamming the door on the little girl, and oh, it's all about respect for women. It's not all about respect for women. That's not what the evidence shows. And if we're going to do, I mean, I don't know that any of those education campaigns are likely to change anything. There's no good evidence for that in this particular really complex social problem. But if we're going to do a campaign around violence, let's tell the truth. Let's tell the whole story and talk about all people having to learn not to be aggressive towards each other, not just men.
Okay.
Can I ask, are governments really the right place to go for putting out these programs and managing them, or is it more...
Well, it's really important governments look at the evidence, because governments are making the laws
and allocating the money.
And allocating the money, and, you know, running, you know, giving money to the courts, and, you know, the Attorney General is advising judges and magistrates, as I've said, on how they should define domestic violence. The government has to be in there. But why aren't they more concerned about the evidence? Why aren't they concerned about where these hundreds of millions of dollars are actually going? And I think we need to put politicians on the spot and start asking some hard questions about this.
Well, I think you started that tonight, if you haven't done it elsewhere as well. Jen, thank you very much for being part of it. As you say, this is a very difficult social issue, and we thank you for your time, and good luck for the continuing advocacy too. We'll be back